Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something truly magical. Well, magical, and just a little bit mischievous. Imagine yourself walking through the winding streets of 18th century Venice, where the air smells of the salty sea and the faint echoing sounds of music swirl through the night. You're heading toward a grand ballroom, but there's something different about tonight. You can't quite place your finger on it. Why? Because everyone is wearing a mask, and the rules of society, well, they've just been thrown out the window. That's right. The Venetian masked ball was a world where anyone, from the humblest to the most powerful, could hide their identity and step into a night full of intrigue, mystery, and, let's be honest, a little bit of mischief. You probably won't survive the chaos if you had to attend one, though. No cell phones, no Google Maps, and definitely no getting lost on purpose. But don't worry, I've got your back. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I know it's a bold request, but hey, a guy's gotta ask. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious to see where you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Venice, the city of canals, art, and endless secrets, was home to some of the most stunning masked balls in history. These were not your average parties. These gatherings were a whole different world where everything from your appearance to your identity could be completely transformed. If you wanted to be the Duke of Verona for a night or a humble baker pretending to be royalty, the masks and costumes made it possible. People would dress to the nines, go all out with lavish fabrics, and gather in the grandest venues. But none of that mattered, because no one knew who anyone really was.
Now, let's talk about the masks themselves. Oh, the masks. You might think they were just for fun, like those novelty ones you see at your local carnival, but there was far more to it than that. The masks weren't just a way to hide your face. They were a powerful tool, an intricate piece of social armor in a world where appearances were everything. The people of Venice had a knack for turning a simple piece of cloth and some feathers into something that could hide an entire identity. Venetian masks weren't just fun little accessories. They were symbols, each telling a story, whether of nobility, deception, or something much more subversive. There were countless styles, but let's start with the most iconic, the bauta. This mask, often paired with a black cloak, was square at the jaw and curved up at the forehead. It was meant to obscure not just the face, but the emotions, too. Think about it. Behind that mask, you could say or do anything without anyone ever knowing who you truly were. Imagine being able to confess all your secrets, your sins, your wildest fantasies, and never have to face the consequences. Who knew that a mask could give you so much power? Historians still argue whether the widespread use of these masks was a way for the lower classes to infiltrate high society and join in on the fun, or whether it was a tool for the elite to keep their dirty deeds hidden. Then, of course, there was the colombina, a half-mask, often decorated with gold leaf, lace, and ribbons. It only covered the eyes and nose, allowing for a little more freedom in expression, but still keeping a sense of anonymity. There's something poetic about how a mask that covers so little can still transform someone entirely. You could be laughing one moment and plotting in secret the next, all without anyone knowing your true face. It was a perfect metaphor for Venetian society itself, elegant, sophisticated, and full of hidden agendas. And let's not forget about the Moretta, the mask that's almost as mysterious as the secretive city itself. It was a black velvet mask that covered the entire face, with no straps. The wearer had to hold it in place with their teeth. Imagine trying to maintain conversation while gripping a mask in your mouth. Still, it was the most exclusive mask of all, often worn by women who were forbidden from speaking in public. A silent, beautiful enigma, the kind of mask that could spark all kinds of rumors and gossip. People might wonder if the quiet woman behind it was hiding a secret romance or a scandalous past. Who's to say? But all these masks shared one key feature. They allowed you to be whoever you wanted. There were no limits. You could be a nobleman one moment, a servant the next. And that's the key to understanding the allure of the Venetian masked balls. They were not just about escapism. They were about freedom, about slipping into a new skin and reinventing yourself.
As we take a step deeper into this world, let's talk about the people who attended these grand balls. You might picture them as elegant, rich, and powerful people living out their most luxurious fantasies. But, like the masks, there was much more beneath the surface. The Venetian masked balls were, in many ways, a playground for the city's elite. The nobility, wealthy merchants, and political figures would rub elbows with each other, their identities hidden behind elaborate disguises. But just as the masks served as an escape, they also represented something far darker: control. Historians still argue whether these balls were just a social escape, or whether they were also carefully orchestrated power plays. For one, Venetian society was always divided, with a strict hierarchy in place. The rich were rich, and the poor, well, they were poor. Except for one night, no one could tell who was who. There was something liberating about being able to throw off your usual societal role and embrace a different version of yourself. You could swap the usual duties of a noblewoman for the excitement of pretending to be a lowly servant, or, better yet, a foreign diplomat whose every word and gesture would be carefully scrutinized. The power of anonymity created an atmosphere where everyone could indulge in their fantasies, as long as they followed the unwritten rules of the ball. One of the most interesting aspects of these events was how they allowed even the most prominent of Venetian figures to slip into a more carefree existence. For example, imagine a nobleman attending the ball, his face concealed by a mask, and suddenly he could go unnoticed among his peers. A high-ranking politician might dance with a commoner without anyone noticing the difference in their social standing. The masked balls allowed for a fluidity of identity, almost like a game, with the rules set by the costumes, the masks, and the expectations of secrecy. It's said that this feeling of equality, even for a night, allowed for a sense of collective freedom that might have been impossible otherwise. But there were other layers to this. Beneath all the beauty and elegance, there were hidden political motives. The balls were not just places for frivolous fun. They were often used as a way to broker deals, form alliances, or even settle scores. Imagine attending a ball with a powerful adversary, your identity hidden behind a mask, but your every move is scrutinized. Maybe, just maybe, you're forming a silent alliance with them while no one is the wiser. These balls were venues for social and political maneuvering in the most covert ways, and not even the Venetian elite could escape their influence. In a way, these events were a microcosm of Venice itself, beautiful, extravagant, and deeply political. The masks served as a social equalizer, but behind those disguises, the same power struggles that ruled the streets of Venice still played out in the dark corners of the ballroom. But what was it really like once you entered the ballroom? Well, imagine stepping through a set of grand double doors and suddenly you're swallowed up by a world of swirling colors, sounds, and masked figures. The ballroom itself was a spectacle. Golden chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, the floors polished to a shine, and the air thick with the fragrance of expensive perfumes and the rustling of elegant gowns. It was like stepping into a dream, but with just a hint of something strange and a little unnerving. The sounds of violins and harpsichords played softly in the background, filling the room with music that was as delicate as it was sophisticated. The dancers glided across the floor in time with the music, their movements elegant and practiced, but behind their perfect poise, there was always that sense of mystery. You couldn't help but wonder, who were these people? What did they look like beneath the mask? What secrets were they hiding? Historians still argue whether these events were meant purely for entertainment or whether the masks created a sense of intimacy that encouraged more daring behavior, things that might have been unthinkable in the daylight hours. After all, when your true identity is concealed, you're freer to explore aspects of yourself that might otherwise remain hidden. You might approach someone you'd never dare speak to in regular society, strike up a conversation, or even indulge in more forbidden pleasures. It's said that some of these masked balls were notorious for their more illicit activities, hidden in the shadows of the grand chandeliers. But don't get too excited. It wasn't all decadence and scandal. The games were just as often playful, filled with wit and clever wordplay that only the most confident could pull off. One popular game was La Gioco della Bottiglia, or the Game of the Bottle. It's remarkably simple. Two people stand across from each other, and they take turns spinning a bottle in the center of the room. When the bottle stops, the person it points to becomes the other's partner for the next dance. But the intrigue lay in the fact that there were no guarantees about who that person might be. You could end up dancing with someone you've secretly admired, or perhaps someone you wouldn't have given the time of day in regular life. This element of chance added another layer of excitement to the evening. There was always a sense of anticipation about what might happen next. While this game may seem innocent enough, it was part of the larger tradition of masked balls, where the line between propriety and taboo could blur in the most unexpected ways. After all, what's more fun than having your life shaped by random chance, especially when no one knows who you really are? The game, much like the entire night, was about stepping outside of your ordinary self, embracing the unknown, and letting fate take the lead. Now, let's dive into the fascinating and sometimes strange world of Venetian ballroom etiquette. While the masks and costumes might suggest complete freedom, make no mistake, these events came with a strict set of unwritten rules. You might think that with all the disguises, anything went. But in reality, the masked balls were highly structured, and social behavior was carefully controlled. You couldn't just waltz in and do whatever you pleased. For instance, there was a very specific dress code. As you might imagine, Venetian nobles didn't just wear any old thing to these balls. No, the outfits were a carefully constructed blend of opulence and detail. Men were often seen wearing long velvet cloaks, embroidered with gold and silver, while women sported elaborate gowns with high collars, ruffled sleeves, and rich fabrics. And then, of course, there were the masks, which had to be as extravagant as the rest of the attire. If your mask didn't live up to the standard, well, you could quickly become the subject of whispered gossip. It was a society where appearance was everything, and the slightest misstep in your costume could be noticed and judged. But the rules weren't just about appearance. The way you moved through the ballroom mattered too. Historians still argue whether the formality of the dance itself was a direct reflection of Venetian social norms, or whether it was an attempt to replicate the grandeur of European courts. Either way, the dances were intricate and required precision. There were specific steps and positions that had to be followed. Too much improvisation, and you might find yourself out of favor. As you floated through the ballroom, you couldn't help but notice the carefully measured steps of those around you. No one was ever too exuberant. There was an elegance to everything. The conversations, the gestures, the dances. You couldn't simply rush up to someone and start chatting like old friends. If you wanted to make an impression, it had to be subtle. A glance across the room, a delicate hand gesture, perhaps a wink. These were the secret signals that allowed you to navigate the social game of the masked ball. You see, Venice's elite didn't just play dress-up. They played the long game. For women, the rules could be particularly tricky. Many noblewomen, especially those of high status, were expected to uphold a certain level of mystery, particularly at these masked events. Their movements were graceful and deliberate, and most of their conversations took place in whispers or behind the mask. In fact, some say that the reason many women chose to wear the Moretta mask, which required them to hold it in place with their teeth, was because it prevented them from speaking. While this might sound strange today, it was an intentional way of keeping the ladies silent, mysterious, and unattainable. Venetian society was nothing if not complicated, with layers of expectations that no one ever quite fully understood, until, of course, you were in the middle of it.
In a way, these rules helped create a space where the unspoken could thrive. The subtlety of it all, the half-formed gestures, the little looks that lasted just a moment too long, was as important as the dances or the drinks. Everything was a game, and the stakes were high. You had to understand the rules if you wanted to play and succeed. But what made these rules so intriguing was that just like the masks themselves, they were cloaked in mystery. No one quite knew all the rules, and maybe, just maybe, that was the appeal. Let's talk about the venues, shall we? The places where these masked balls took place were almost as spectacular as the events themselves. Imagine walking through the grand, sweeping halls of Venice's most luxurious palaces. Every detail was carefully crafted to transport you into a world of wonder. Murano glass chandeliers glittered above you, casting a warm glow across the marble floors. The walls were adorned with elaborate tapestries and paintings, many of which depicted the very scenes you were witnessing in real time. Masked figures dancing, laughing, whispering in the shadows. These ballrooms were usually found in the grandest Venetian palaces, and not just anywhere. Only the most elite families were privileged enough to host one of these events. Venice's opulent aristocracy wanted to ensure that these gatherings were more than just fun nights out. They were status symbols, opportunities to flaunt wealth and power. You see, the very act of hosting a ball was a sign of prestige. The grander the ball, the more social capital the host gained. And of course, the finer the ballroom, the more desirable the event. As you stepped inside one of these ballrooms, the scent of burning wax candles mixed with the faint smell of fresh flowers, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. The space was always crowded with finely dressed men and women, their conversations muted by the hum of orchestras playing in the background. From the moment you entered, you were submerged into a world of grandeur and opulence. And yet behind the glitz and glamour, there was an air of secrecy that no one could escape. As I've mentioned before, Venetian society was a world of complex layers, wealth, influence, and social structures that were all carefully constructed and defended. The ballrooms weren't just places for dancing. They were also places where power could be gained or lost in the most subtle of ways. The location of a ballroom wasn't just about beauty, it was about strategy. Hosts invited only the people they trusted, or those who could elevate their own position. With the right people gathered under one roof, it was possible to make important deals, form alliances, and make your political move without anyone realizing what was truly happening beneath the surface. Some of the most famous venues for these masquerades were the Palazzo Ducale and Palazzo Pisani Moretta. The Palazzo Ducale, the Doge's palace, was one of the most prestigious and historic places to host a ball. With its immense facade, intricate architecture, and waterfront views, it was a symbol of Venetian power. If you were invited to dance there, you were likely rubbing elbows with the most influential figures in Venice, nobles, politicians, and perhaps even foreign diplomats. But the Palazzo Pisani Moretta had its own charm too. This venue was famous for its rich, opulent interiors and its intimate, less formal vibe. It was here that the masks came to life. The atmosphere was less stiff and more playful, as the guests took full advantage of the anonymity masks provided. Whether in the grand, imposing halls of the Palazzo Ducale or the more secluded spaces of the Pisani Moretta, the Venetian masked ball was always a world apart, a space where the real world faded away and only the magic of the night remained. Even though most of us will never step foot in such grand spaces, it's easy to imagine that for those lucky enough to attend, these balls were as close to living a fairy tale as you could get. These grand locations weren't just settings for a dance. They were settings for entire lives to be shaped, alliances to be forged, and secrets to be kept. Now let's take a moment to explore the true political power of these Venetian masked balls. While many think of them simply as lavish social events, they were also critical spaces where power dynamics shifted, both in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. Venice, a republic built on political intrigue and mercantile might, understood that the true heart of influence often lay not in grand speeches or treaties, but in quiet, behind-the-scenes maneuvering. And that's exactly what these balls allowed. An opportunity to broker alliances, settle old grudges, and sow the seeds for future political and economic shifts. One might assume that the balls were simply an outlet for the wealthy and powerful to enjoy themselves, but it was far more complex than that. The Venetian nobility, with their sharp minds and even sharper ambition, understood that politics in Venice wasn't just about who you knew, but who you could charm. And the mask? It became the perfect tool for this subtle yet powerful game. With a mask in place, a person could speak freely to someone they wouldn't normally associate with in public, be it an enemy, a rival, or a member of another powerful family. In fact, some historians argue that the very reason the ball became a staple of Venetian politics was because it provided a safe space for these clandestine dealings. Imagine this. You're a powerful merchant who's looking to gain favor with the Duke of Venice. On any other day, you might not get an audience with him. But tonight, at the masquerade, your mask is your invitation into his world. You don't need to announce yourself as a merchant. You can simply be a nobleman, a diplomat, or anyone you want. The anonymity the mask provided allowed you to sidestep the usual social barriers. You might even be able to get the Duke to consider a proposal without him knowing who you really are. This would have been nearly impossible in the structured, rigid atmosphere of everyday Venetian life. But what's even more intriguing is how these balls were sometimes used to send a message. If you were a politician or someone with a lot to lose, a masked ball was the perfect place to send subtle signals to your rivals. Perhaps you wore a certain color to indicate allegiance or a particular style of mask to demonstrate your status. Sometimes, a seemingly innocent interaction, such as a dance or a toast, could convey a message that would otherwise be lost in the noise of political speeches and public appearances. While it's easy to think of these events as purely decorative or frivolous, they were far from it. In fact, many of Venice's most powerful leaders and influencers would carefully plan their attendance at these masquerades, using them as a means to solidify power, reinforce allegiances, and, in some cases, discredit rivals. The balls were a key part of the Venetian political machinery, operating much like a well-oiled political network, but hidden in plain sight behind a veil of fun and frivolity. The mix of diplomacy and deception at these events would often spill over into the real world. Some of the most important alliances of the time were either born or sealed at these balls, and some rivalries came to a head over a whispered conversation in the shadowy corners of the ballroom. The masked balls weren't just a glamorous retreat from everyday life. They were central to how power was both maintained and contested in the political chess game of Venice. But it wasn't all grand diplomacy and secret alliances. Venetian masked balls had their fair share of playful mischief, too. Behind the glittering masks, some guests let loose in ways that were far less dignified than their high society status would suggest. You see, while these events were a time for political intrigue and extravagant costumes, they were also a moment of freedom, a break from the heavy expectations of Venetian nobility. After all, what's the point of wearing a mask if you can't have a little fun? One of the most cherished traditions at these balls was the farsa, or the farce. These were playful, humorous performances or skits that often poked fun at the pomp and circumstance of Venetian society. The aristocracy, known for their serious demeanor during everyday life, would indulge in these performances, laughing at themselves and each other in a way that was both rare and liberating. The farsa often involved exaggerated slapstick humor and clever wordplay, making fun of the rich, the powerful, and sometimes even the political figures who attended the ball.
And it wasn't just about the skits themselves, it was about the very idea of making fun of society's norms, if only for a night. You might be imagining a stuffy ballroom, everyone sipping wine in complete silence. But that wasn't the whole picture. Sure, there was plenty of music, genteel conversation, and refined dancing, but there was also a certain undercurrent of mischief that ran through the evening. Imagine a well-dressed noblewoman, her eyes hidden behind an ornate mask, winking at a guest across the room, signaling that the night's festivities were about to take a turn. Perhaps a playful game of la gioco della bottiglia, the game of the bottle, would break out, and suddenly the evening was filled with laughter and a sense of unpredictability. The masks were the perfect tool for this. And don't forget the tarantella, a lively and sometimes wild dance that was a favorite among those looking to let off steam. This spirited Italian folk dance, with its rapid footwork and energetic spins, provided a perfect outlet for the guests to shake off their reserved roles and enjoy a little carefree movement. But it wasn't just for fun, oh no. The tarantella was also considered a cure for the tarantula bite, which, according to popular belief, could drive you mad. No one knew if the dance actually worked, but after a few spins, you probably weren't worried about much else. The idea of using dance as a cure for insanity? Well, that's the kind of playful, whimsical energy that filled these masquerades. The farces, the games, the dances, all of these elements worked together to create an environment where the rules of proper society could be bent or even broken. For one night, people were free to express themselves in ways they never would have been able to without the anonymity the masks provided. This wasn't just a party. It was a chance to let go of the constraints of daily life and, even if only for a few hours, embrace something lighter, something more mischievous. But let's not forget that even in the midst of all this fun, there was always the looming reminder that the masks served a much deeper purpose. You could be as carefree as you wanted, but you were still a participant in a game of power. The lines between play and politics often blurred, and while a laugh or a playful glance might be exchanged in a moment of freedom, there was always the knowledge that the real world was just beyond the door. The fun, the mischief, the games, it was all part of the grand performance that kept Venice's elite on their toes. However, as much as the Venetian masked balls were an escape, they also harbored a darker side, a side that was only hinted at in whispers and rumors. Behind the glitter and elegance of the ballroom, there were consequences to the freedom these events promised. Venetian society, for all its ostentatious displays of power and wealth, was still deeply entangled in rigid social structures, and stepping outside of these lines didn't always come without a price. The mask, once a symbol of freedom and anonymity, could sometimes be a mask for something far more sinister. One such consequence was the social scandal that could arise from an evening at the ball. While the masks hid identities, they didn't erase the fact that everyone was still operating under the heavy gaze of societal expectations. It wasn't uncommon for people to gossip about the interactions that took place under the cover of a mask. The anonymity granted by the masks didn't always prevent scandal. Sometimes it only deepened it. Historians still argue whether the masks allowed people to truly act on their hidden desires, or whether the very act of being anonymous fueled public curiosity and suspicion. The scandal of the incognito affair, a term used to describe secret romantic liaisons, wasn't unheard of. An illicit kiss, a hidden glance, or a whispered conversation could cause a stir long after the event was over. Masks allowed for these fleeting moments of passion, but they also ensured that no one would know for sure who was involved. These were the kinds of games that were played beneath the elegant dances, and although they were often whispered about in the shadows, no one could be certain if they were true or merely the result of overactive imaginations. But in the end, these balls were not only about the private intrigues of the night. Sometimes, the masks themselves held darker meanings, masks that were used as a means of hiding even more than just identity. In some cases, the balls were used as a way to conceal shame or guilt. Imagine someone who had committed a terrible deed. Perhaps they had been part of a political conspiracy or were involved in a dishonorable act. Behind the mask, they could escape the consequences of their actions for just a little while, attending the ball as if they were a respected member of society. It was a way to hide from the past, even if only for a fleeting moment. These darker moments, though often overlooked in the grand festivities of the ball, were woven into the fabric of Venetian life. In a society built on secrecy, the masked balls provided a space to indulge in both the fantasy and the fear of anonymity. There was a sense of safety in the masks. They protected people from judgment, but they also served to amplify the sense of mystery that made the event both thrilling and terrifying. What might seem like a playful night could, in fact, be the most politically charged event of the year. Power, intrigue, and scandal were always a heartbeat away, hidden just beneath the surface of the glittering masks. As the night continued, the glittering world of the Venetian masked balls would slowly shift from light-hearted revelry to something much more profound. The grandeur and the games, the laughs and the playful glances, all began to fade into the background, leaving something deeper in their place, something that became more tangible as the hours wore on. For all their excess and opulence, these events were tinged with a sense of melancholy, a reminder that behind the masks, everyone was carrying their own burdens. Though these balls were meant to be an escape, they also served as a quiet meditation on the human desire for connection. With masks in place, the ball provided the illusion of anonymity, but underneath, the guests were all still human, with hearts beating fast, hopes, desires, and perhaps regrets. It was the perfect place to shed the heavy weight of status and let something more vulnerable emerge. Some historians argue that this was, in fact, the most profound aspect of the masquerades, the brief respite it offered from the highly stratified society of Venice. For one night, people could transcend their usual roles and speak, laugh, and dance, without fear of the judgment that came with their usual identities. But of course, it wasn't just the freedom from judgment that drew people in. It was the freedom from their own limitations. That's why the Venetian masked balls were so magnetic. People didn't just come for the glamour, the games, or the food, though all those were certainly part of the experience. They came to break free from the constraints of their lives. The masks allowed people to step into new identities, to say things they might not normally say, and to move in ways they might not normally move. In that moment, it wasn't about who you were. It was about who you could become. But let's not be naive. Even in this world of freedom, there were rules that governed the ball. And one of the most striking aspects of these events was how incredibly structured they were, even within their seeming chaos. There were times for dancing, times for drinking, times for conversation. Certain dances were reserved for certain people. Those in power or those with status would always be invited to the first and most important dances, leaving others to wait their turn. Masks, costumes, and behavior, everything was a performance, and everyone had a role to play. No matter how free you thought you were always performing for an audience. In this way, the masked ball was a brilliant metaphor for the larger political life of Venice. Like the city itself, it was a delicate balancing act between freedom and control. There was just enough freedom to keep the elite entertained, but just enough structure to maintain the social order. The masks provided the illusion of anonymity, but they never really erased the lines of power, status, and influence. As much as people longed to be free for just one night, they were always confined by the invisible structures that held Venice together. The ball, as it turned out, was a perfect reflection of the city itself, beautiful, mysterious, and full of secrets, but always governed by the same forces of control. And as the night wore on, the masks would start to feel a little heavier, the dances a little slower, and the laughter a little less genuine. The illusion of freedom that the ball had created would begin to dissipate, leaving behind the reality of Venice, the real world, with all its complexities and struggles, waiting just outside the door. It was a fleeting escape, and the beauty of it was that it could never truly be recreated. Once the masks came off, the guests would return to their lives with all their responsibilities and roles waiting for them. The masquerade was over, but for a few hours, they had been free. But what happens after the last waltz? The grand masquerades might have been over, but their reverberations were felt long after the masks were removed
and the chandeliers were extinguished. The masked ball, like many of Venice's most extravagant traditions, was ephemeral. Its magic existed only in the moment, and once it was over, what remained was the memory of it. The laughter, the faces half-remembered, the touch of a hand, and the secrecy that hung in the air. For the guests, the ball often left them with a sense of longing. There was something undeniably addictive about the masquerade, a temporary life outside the constraints of your usual identity. You could pretend for just one night that you were someone else. And in a city like Venice, where politics, social hierarchy, and personal ambitions constantly shaped people's lives, that freedom was intoxicating. It was the closest thing to true liberation that Venice had to offer. Historians often ponder whether the masked balls of Venice were truly about entertainment, or if they were something deeper, a subconscious attempt to break free from the ever-present societal norms and structures that governed every aspect of Venetian life. After all, Venice was not only the home of great art and culture, but also a place where power was constantly in flux, where alliances could shift overnight, and where appearances often meant more than reality. The balls, in some ways, offered a brief respite from that overwhelming weight of responsibility. But no sooner had the music stopped and the dancers left the floor than those social constructs came rushing back, as if the night's escapism had been nothing more than a dream. Perhaps it was the brief nature of these events that made them so appealing. Like many beautiful things in life, they were fleeting. Once the grand mask had been lifted, the people who had danced the night away were once again back to their usual roles in society, playing the same political games, navigating the same power dynamics. The masquerades were an escape, but once the masks were off, so too was the illusion of freedom. As time passed, Venetian masked balls became more and more of a rarity. The allure of the anonymous revelry slowly faded as Venetian society became more rigid, more self-conscious, and perhaps more aware of the consequences of having so much freedom under the veil of anonymity. The practice became less about political maneuvering and more about indulgence in excess, but even that could not last forever. Venice, with all its glory and its vices, eventually gave way to the forces of history. The traditions that had once defined the city slowly crumbled, and with them, the once vibrant world of the masked ball. But their legacy remains. Even today, Venetian masks are some of the most iconic symbols of the city, worn by tourists and performers alike. The tradition has endured, albeit in a modernized form. The idea of hiding behind a mask, whether for celebration, secrecy, or social freedom, is something that resonates even in our own time. The Venetian masked ball might have been a product of its era, but its essence, its mystery, and its power still captivate us. Perhaps when we put on a mask today, whether for a festival, a costume party, or even just for fun, we are tapping into that same desire for escape and anonymity that defined those grand Venetian nights. Behind every mask lies the potential for transformation. And in a city like Venice, a mask wasn't just a disguise. It was a key to a world of secrets, mischief, and infinite possibilities. As we reflect on the legacy of Venice's masked balls, it's fascinating to consider how these grand events weren't just fleeting social affairs. They were deeply woven into the fabric of Venetian identity itself. The masquerade was more than a spectacle. It was a ritual that allowed Venetians to play with the idea of self-perception and society's expectations. The very act of masking one's identity raised questions about the nature of identity itself. Were you the person you appeared to be? Or were you the person you could become when you let go of the restrictions of your true self? In Venetian society, a person's identity was determined largely by their birth, their family's wealth, and their social standing. These balls, in their most idealistic form, allowed people to escape these labels, even if just for one night. The mask provided the freedom to explore who you could be beyond the limits imposed by your position in life. It allowed a merchant to step into the shoes of a nobleman,
a servant to pretend to be royalty. Everyone, no matter their status, had the opportunity to play a different role, even if only for a few hours. And that is perhaps the most enduring lesson from the Venetian masquerades, that even in the most stratified of societies, the desire for self-expression and personal transformation can never truly be suppressed. Historians and cultural theorists still debate what these masquerades meant for the development of European social structures. Some claim that they were a symbol of the disintegration of the old hierarchical systems, while others argue that they were an expression of an early form of modern individualism. The idea that one could reinvent oneself, if only for a moment, was radical at the time. In fact, it was a quiet rebellion against the rigidity of Venetian society. But whether they were a harbinger of social change or simply an elaborate form of escapism, the balls were undeniably a reflection of the constant tension between freedom and structure in Venice. Today, when we think of Venice, we often conjure up images of the canals, the gondolas, and the magnificent architecture. Yet, it's the masked balls that remain one of the most enduring symbols of the city's unique history. You can visit Venice and buy your own mask, designed to reflect that age-old grandeur. But it's almost impossible to replicate the magic of those nights. The atmosphere was something beyond what any costume or mask can fully capture. The tension between freedom and control, anonymity and identity that defined the world of the Venetian ball. But perhaps that's the beauty of it. The magic of the Venetian masked ball lies in its elusiveness, in the idea that it was a world you could only access momentarily. And once it was over, you were left with nothing but the memory of it. The flickering of a candlelight, the rustle of a gown, the soft murmur of voices behind a mask. Venice itself, with its narrow alleyways, its labyrinth of canals, and its majestic palaces, continues to evoke the same sense of mystery that the balls did. The city itself is a kind of masquerade, an old world wrapped in beauty, secrecy, and the lingering echo of a history that can never truly be forgotten. So as the years go by and the echoes of the Venetian masked balls fade, they still have something to teach us. They remind us that beneath the masks we wear, whether they are literal or metaphorical, there is always a desire to be more than we are, to step outside the roles society gives us, and to embrace the potential for transformation. As we near the end of our journey through the glittering, enigmatic world of the Venetian masked balls, it's worth considering how this tradition has influenced the way we celebrate today. Though Venice's masquerades may be a thing of the past, the allure of disguise, of stepping outside of our daily selves, is very much alive. Think about modern-day masquerades, masquerade balls, or even masquerade-themed events you might have seen in movies or attended yourself. The concept is timeless. A mask is a gateway, not just to freedom, but to an entirely new identity. The legacy of Venice's masked balls lives on in these modern traditions, but there's also an unexpected way the Venetian spirit of the masked ball permeates our culture, through the very idea of anonymity and the thrill of the unknown. It's there in the digital world, where people can hide behind screen names and create new personas, where they can step into different roles with no one the wiser. The same thrill people experienced in 18th century Venice, swapping identities for the night, is something we still chase today, albeit in a different form. Social media, for example, allows us to live a version of the Venetian masquerade, albeit without the ballrooms and the grand costumes. People can curate their lives behind carefully crafted profiles, creating versions of themselves that feel freer or more fantastical than their everyday realities. It's a form of digital masquerading, hiding behind avatars, masks of identity, and filters that allow us to explore parts of ourselves that we might not show to the outside world. There's an undeniable connection between the masks of Venice and the curated personas that exist online. Interestingly, these digital masks aren't always about deceit. Sometimes they offer a kind of emotional safety. Much like the ball guests who could reveal their desires and fears behind a physical mask,
we now have the opportunity to reveal parts of ourselves in digital spaces without fear of judgment. But just as in Venice, these masks can also carry with them the weight of social expectations. Just as there were rules to the Venetian ballroom, the dances, the etiquette, the unspoken social contracts, there are rules to the digital world. These digital masks come with their own set of pressures to be more glamorous, more successful, or to craft a life that others will envy. And what about the thrill of being someone else for a while? The Venetian masked ball wasn't just about hiding your identity. It was about exploring what it could feel like to step outside the boundaries of your everyday life. The same is true in the modern world, where role-playing games, fantasy genres, and even cosplay events allow people to embody different characters, whether they're heroes, villains, or mythical creatures. The desire to reinvent ourselves is timeless. Just as it was in Venice, it's still a deeply ingrained part of how we celebrate, escape, and explore new identities. But there's something else we should reflect on before we end this journey. Even though the masks are now long gone and the grand palaces have quieted, the spirit of the Venetian masked ball is still alive in the way we handle secrecy and our deepest desires. Perhaps this is the lasting message of the Venetian masquerades, that behind every mask lies a desire for freedom, for expression, and for transformation. The masks of Venice may have disappeared, but the idea of playing a role, of stepping into someone else's shoes for a while, is something we continue to do in our own ways. And so, as you drift into sleep tonight, consider this. Whether in the halls of a grand Venetian palace or behind the screen of a computer, we all wear masks. Some are seen by the world, some only by ourselves. But maybe, just like the masked ball guests of Venice, we can take solace in the fact that we're allowed, at least once in a while, to step outside of the person we usually are and embrace someone new, and perhaps, just for a moment, feel a little freer. As we move toward the end of this journey, let's take a step back and reflect on the broader implications of the Venetian masked balls, particularly in how they shaped the way we view anonymity and identity today. The idea of stepping into a new persona, hiding behind a mask, and exploring different facets of ourselves was both a rebellious act and a deeply personal experience for the people of Venice. These grand events allowed individuals to live out their wildest fantasies, whether that was a fleeting romance or a political move, and in doing so, they invited us to consider what it means to be truly free. In modern life, we don't often have the opportunity to slip into a mask in quite the same way. Sure, we dress up for Halloween or put on costumes for special events, but it's not quite the same. The act of masking ourselves in Venice was an act of transgression against a rigid social structure, one where the roles were already decided for you. Back then, your birth and your family's standing determined much of who you were. But at the ball, well, for a few precious hours, you could be anyone. Historians still argue whether this kind of social experiment had a profound effect on how the people of Venice saw themselves, or whether it was merely an elaborate distraction, a way to momentarily escape the weight of their roles. Today we see these same themes of identity and anonymity playing out in different ways. Take, for example, the explosion of online communities, virtual worlds, and video games, where people craft avatars and personas that are often entirely different from their real selves. In these spaces, much like at a Venetian ball, people can shed the constraints of their everyday lives and embrace something new, something unrecognizable. The allure of digital spaces, with their opportunities for anonymity and reinvention, mirrors that of the masked balls in Venice. In both cases, the mask, whether physical or digital, allows us to explore different versions of ourselves, to be someone we might not dare to be in the real world. But perhaps the most powerful lesson that the Venetian masked balls offer us is not just about what happens when we step into a new identity, but what happens when we take the mask off. After the ball ended, after the final dance and the last glass of wine was drunk,
The guests were left with their real selves again. The anonymity of the night was gone, and they had to face the world as they were, masks removed. There's something poignant about that, isn't there? The reality check that comes with taking off the mask. It makes us wonder, what would we learn about ourselves if we could live, just for a while, behind a veil of anonymity? Would we return to our true selves, or would we forever be changed by the freedom the mask offered? In a world that increasingly encourages us to curate our identities, whether through social media, fashion, or even our career choices, the metaphor of the Venetian masked ball still holds weight. How often do we, consciously or unconsciously, wear masks? How often do we shape our identities for the sake of others, or to fit into the roles society expects us to play? In the world of the masquerade, we're all wearing masks of some sort, playing parts, hiding parts of ourselves, perhaps in an effort to protect, to escape, or even to project an ideal version of who we want to be. And in the end, isn't that what the Venetian masked balls taught us? That identity is fluid, that our roles aren't always as fixed as we think they are, and that there is power in the moments when we get to step outside of them. The masks of Venice, like the masks we wear today, were both a form of escape and a reflection of deeper truths about ourselves. Whether in 18th century Venice or in today's world, the desire to hide, to reveal, and to transform is something universal, something that continues to draw us to the mystery of the mask. As the night draws to a close, let yourself reflect on what masks you wear in your own life. Think about the moments when you felt free enough to reveal a different side of yourself, and those times when you felt the weight of playing a role. Like the guests of Venice, we all find ourselves slipping in and out of different identities, sometimes without even realizing it. But as we fade into sleep tonight, consider this. We don't always need a mask to discover who we truly are. Sometimes it's in the quiet moments, when we let go of the persona we've crafted for the world, that we can finally breathe and feel truly free. As we reach the final part of our journey through the masked world of 18th century Venice, it's only fitting that we end on a more contemplative note. The masquerades, with their elegance, mystery, and playful intrigue, were fleeting. Like all grand traditions, they eventually faded away, replaced by the shifting tides of history. Venice, as a city and as a society, evolved, and with that change came the decline of many of the traditions that had made it so iconic. But the legacy of the Venetian masked ball still lingers, quietly influencing how we see identity, secrecy, and personal transformation. What can we take from the masked balls of Venice all these years later? Perhaps it's the reminder that, in some ways, we are all performers. Whether it's in the ballroom or in our daily lives, we wear masks. These masks may not always be literal. Most of the time, they are the roles we play, the faces we present to the world. At times, it may feel like we're on display, just as those Venetian nobles were, dancing, laughing, and exchanging glances behind the cover of anonymity. But unlike the guests of Venice, who were free for one night to shed the weight of their roles, we often carry our masks for much longer, sometimes indefinitely. There is something oddly comforting about that, though, isn't there? To think that everyone, even those who seem the most confident or in control, is wearing some sort of mask. We all have those moments when we wish we could escape, even for just a little while, and be someone else, someone freer, someone with fewer responsibilities or expectations. The Venetian masked ball was a place where that wish could come true. But in the real world, we often have to find our own ways of stepping outside of our roles and exploring who we truly are. For some, that's through art. For others, it might be through travel, or perhaps even through a simple change in routine. Whatever form it takes, the spirit of those Venetian balls, the desire to be free, to explore new identities, and to embrace transformation, is still with us. And just like Venice, with its delicate balance of power, beauty, and secrecy, we too have our own masquerades. The world around us, with all its layers, pressures, and expectations, often requires us to wear a mask, sometimes for protection, sometimes for gain, and sometimes simply to fit in. But just as the guests of the Venetian balls would eventually remove their masks and return to their lives, we too must face the world without them. The question is, will we be ready to confront who we are when we let go of the disguise? As the evening comes to a close, let's take a deep breath and think about how we approach our own masks. Just like those who wandered the ballrooms of Venice, we have the opportunity to step into new identities, to play roles, to explore who we might be. But in the quiet moments, when the music stops and the masks come off, what remains? It's a question worth considering as we drift into sleep tonight, because in the end, the most important identity we wear is the one we choose when no one is looking. Now, as the night wraps up and the world quiets, let the images of Venice's grand masked balls fade from your mind.
Picture yourself, free of any mask, resting in the peace of the night, where the only thing you need to be is yourself. And as you drift off into a restful sleep, may you find the same kind of freedom that the guests of those grand masquerades sought. Freedom to be, to transform, and to simply be at peace.